proceed to turn off our electronic light this time. Good morning, John.
Good morning. It depends. Off the record, do we have anything we need to take up? We're still waiting on one juror.
Want to ask me a question also?
Just need to ask your permission on this.
Okay, well, just let me know. Are there any matters that we need to take up before we bring jurors out?
Not from the state, Your Honor.
All right, very good. Mr. Wallace, if you'll resume your seat. And bailiff, if you'll bring jurors, please. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Thank you all again for arriving promptly so we can get underway. If you'll check, make sure you have your notebooks so that we have that straight. We're ready to presume with the cross-examination of Mr. Wallace. Mr. Wallace, do you recognize you're still under oath, sir?
I do, sir.
All right. Mr. Arbor?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Wallace.
Good morning, Mr. Arbor.
Just for the record, this morning before we started, I gave you a copy to look at of that federal case of the Roe v. Thornburg that we discussed briefly yesterday. It's, as you pointed out, it is with respect to is a federal case, but it deals with states other than North Carolina, correct?
Correct. It applies the law of unincorporated associations in Texas and Pennsylvania.
Basically said that there's no prohibition to, and that would be consistent with North Carolina, no prohibition to a campaign committee, if it wanted to. It can set itself up as a not-for-profit corporation and operate in that fashion, right?
Both North Carolina and federal law would permit that.
It's just that that was not the case in this instance.
Correct.
And that case did give, at least with respect to that particular case, Carl Rove versus Thornburg, indicated that a candidate who is not incorporated may incur some personal liability from debts incurred by the campaign committee, correct?
Apparently, on the facts of that case, the trial court found liability on the part of the candidate. I didn't exhaustively read the case, which is lengthy, but as I say, it applies law of Pennsylvania and Texas.
Correct. I think I have been, but I just want to be clear. When you had the meeting with Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill on the 15th, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so if I'm wrong in characterizing it this way, I want you to correct it, okay? But what I gathered from your testimony was the fact that there was this loan showing as still outstanding, when you had been given information that the loan was supposed to have been satisfied, was, and I think your words were, troubling, but did not give rise to any concerns that there was any type of perhaps criminal activity afoot. Would that be a fair characterization of your assessment of that day?
At that moment, on Monday morning, April 15th, I believe that there had been error in the preparation of the report, preparation of the draft report.
Exactly. You've mentioned to police, you've mentioned to district attorneys and investigators in your preparation for this trial, that on that day there was that issue, but beyond that issue, it wasn't that you were even conceiving that any criminal impropriety.
I was not in receipt of any information from which I would have concluded that criminal impropriety had occurred.
You were just operating the assumption there's an error that needs to be rectified.
From what I was presented, it appeared that there had been an error, and I requested that it be rectified.
The concern escalated afterwards a little bit when you got, first of all, the notification from Tom Keating about the FEC website, correct?
I'm not certain how my communication with Mr. Keating was initiated, but upon seeing the FEC website, my concerns escalated, yes.
Which prompted your sending the email to Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn.
Yes, sir.
But still, you were not would be fair to say, fair for me to say, you were still not in a mindset that there was anything criminal going on. Would that be fair? At that point.
I didn't make the assumption at that point that there was criminal wrongdoing going on, although I became substantially more concerned when I saw the letter of February 15th, which indicated that the report, which was to have been filed in January, had not been filed.
And that's, now you and I will go back to our old tort days. There's a difference between a criminal act and a negligent act. Agreed?
Certainly.
Negligence is when someone just fails to exercise a duty of care that they owe, correct?
Yes.
When you saw that there was these letters that you had not been previously alerted to. And of course, on those letters was that chart, on one of the two letters, was that chart that we reviewed with the jury yesterday, which talked about the other troubling thing. I won't rehash it, but about the thing about refunds having been made to certain donors in excess of the amount that those donors had given. Any mild concerns you would have had on Monday about, rectifying the report would have been certainly escalated to at least a concern that there's been some negligence. Would that be fair?
Fair, yes, sir.
But not criminal activity.
I didn't conclude upon finding those letters that there had been criminal activity. I concluded that there were substantial issues which required resolution.
And again, and I've been in your position sitting in that chair for other occasions. And we're terrible witnesses because we're very careful with our words for obvious reasons. But if there was an idea in your head of more than, say, negligence, so first, maybe a record, on Monday the 15th, a record-keeping concern. Would that be fair?
A reporting concern.
At the time that you get notified and personally observe, which I think we said was the 17th, the FEC website. Should probably ask about that. That would have escalated your concern to at least the possibility of negligence that you'd want to investigate, correct?
Yes.
And just for clarification, the 17th is the day that you send the help message to Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn, correct?
Correct.
I don't know if you answered this question, I don't recall it. I'm just assuming that when you found the website information that day, you sent that notification out to them the same day.
Yes.
So probably the 17th would have been the date that you were seeing the website information.
Upon seeing those items, I corresponded with Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn immediately.
Okay, so we fairly assume, you don't know what time you were looking at the FEC website, but you know it was prior to 4:42 on the 17th.
No, but I recognize that it required immediate action.
So more than likely, immediately prior to that, that's when you're seeing this, and you're like, hey, sent out a quick thing. Someone tell me about this.
Yes, sir.
Particularly since you just met. But it's still, now your concerns are elevated to one of there may be some negligence, you're still not thinking criminal activity, correct?
I didn't assume criminal activity at that moment, no. I didn't necessarily conclude that there was negligence, but there was at least negligence at that time.
At least the possibility of negligence, at least, more than the possibility. Because as the treasurer, you at least knew that as you sat there on April 17th and you see these two letters, you know for a fact that from your experience in having done this, those letters went out to the campaign. You could pretty much count on that, right? That the FEC had sent those letters out to the campaign.
That was certainly a fair presumption from seeing those letters on the website.
And based upon your experience and having done this before, if it's on the FEC website, more than likely that letter went out.
Yes, sir.
All right. And at least from that standpoint, you know, hey, I just met with these people on Monday. They didn't show me those. So you know there's at least somebody's dropping the ball somewhere. But not yet thinking criminal activity. Would that be fair?
I would say that one begins to worry upon seeing these things because the failure to file a report is a matter of significance.
Well,
but one can't draw.
At that point, let me say this then. when I say criminal activity, you might be concerned about the violation of some federal election law for the maintenance of campaign accounts, because there are laws with respect to that, right? There are penalties and some criminal sanctions that can be imposed for those types of things, correct?
It would be an egregious reporting violation that would result in a criminal penalty, but seeing the absence noting the absence of a report, seeing that on the FEC website, gives rise to concern, and those concerns, in one's imagination, can run the gamut from agency error to wrongdoing concealed, and it was not possible from the information that I had to draw a conclusion at that point, which is why I initiated the inquiry of Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn.
I understand, but my point is this: on the 17th,
Yes, sir.
your concerns have not yet elevated to the point where, and I'm not talking about anybody else or what somebody could do. I'm talking about your concerns on that day, on the 17th. You're not at the point where you're assuming or presuming there's some criminal activity that's occurred.
Correct.
That concern, would it be fair to say, arises after you've gone to the bank and realize that, and find out for the first time that the bank account has been depleted of its funds, and that the money that you had been reported to you as having been in there was not in there. Then you have concerns of potential criminal activity afoot. Would that be fair?
Certainly at that point, I
Something more
reached
than
the
negligence.
conclusion that something more than negligence had occurred. And
Okay,
excuse
hold on.
me,
But that happened after the attack on Ms. Hahn.
correct. The visit to the bank occurred after the attack on Ms. Hahn.
The concern of the possibility of criminal activity, the concern of the money being gone, the concern about the other stuff, but the money being gone now becomes the paramount thing. This is more than just a reporting thing now. This is more than just, maybe Congressman, maybe Brad told them to give money and that somebody didn't look to see if that person, had the right refund. This is different. Someone told me last week there was 60,000 in the account. This count's empty. This is more. This is now the bigger concern, correct?
It was certainly a bigger concern when I made an appearance at the PNC branch and learned that the account had been exhausted of funds.
Now, but that doesn't happen. That concern about the possibility of criminal activity maybe being afoot, that doesn't happen on your mind till that day. Would that be fair?
I did not receive a response on Friday following the communication from Mr. Broyhill. I will tell you, sir, I do not recall whether I took any specific action or had any specific thoughts that day, but time had passed and I had not received a response. I'm sure that at least in the back of my mind I had growing concern at that time, but I don't recall specifically what that concern was, and I needed information in order to be able to form some judgment.
Right. But you sent the email out on the 17th. That was Wednesday. You met on Monday. You sent the email of help on Wednesday, correct?
Yes, sir.
You got the reply from Mr. Broyhill on Thursday. That was the 18th, correct?
Yes, sir.
This tragedy, this thing that happened to Ms. Hahn, is on the Monday, the 22nd, correct?
I believe so, sir.
In between the time of the 18th and the 22nd, you got that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, even that day, Monday. It's not like you're getting on the phone and calling the cops and saying, hey, these people, I got some real big concerns. You didn't have any concerns about, you weren't even thinking about that there was maybe something criminal that's happened in that time frame. Otherwise, as the treasurer, if you had thought there was some criminal activity or some, unexplainable thing that you felt they couldn't answer, you'd have been calling, if not the authorities, you would have at least been calling more people, staffers, Congressman Miller, People that worked for Congressman Miller on the campaign committee. I mean, you knew who all these people were, right? You knew who the people were that were involved in his campaign, right?
Well, there were relatively few at that point, but I was dealing with Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill.
Right. I'm saying you're not reaching out to anybody else in between the time of the 18th and the 22nd.
No, that's right. There was information sufficient to form a concern and perhaps to cause speculation, but I didn't have information from which to conclude that there had been any criminal wrongdoing.
That's the question. When after this happens, and now I'm jumping ahead a little bit, and now you see this news of this terrible event on the 22nd, and you've already testified, that's what caused you to go see what's going on with the account. At no point prior to going to see the account had you called the police or any other staffers or workers. You went over to go check on that account on your own as the treasurer of the campaign to go do your own investigation. You weren't doing an investigation at that point beyond that. Let's go see what's going on with the account. That be fair?
When I went to the PNC branch, it was to gather information and to secure the account.
Right. But I'm saying you didn't reach out to the other staffers. You didn't reach out to Congressman Miller. You might have reached out to Congressman Miller. I did. You did. Because I think you said you needed to talk to him because he might have been the one with signatory power that could have frozen the account if necessary.
The bank required his authority to act, to enable me to act.
But you weren't calling around trying to do some investigation to find out, about what happened with the Hahns and Mr. Broyhill and all that. That was not your concern. There were others working on that. The police were doing that. Your thing was, look, I'm the treasurer of this campaign account. I'm going to go get this thing squared, find out what's going on, and that's what you did.
Yes.
Okay. Without alerting a lot of other people to anything. You were just, other than Congressman Miller.
My contacts included Ms. Hahn, Mr. Broyhill, and Congressman Miller.
Right, and Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill were not available to you, obviously, after the event.
So I initiated contact with Congressman Miller and visited the bank.
Thank you. So we sort of went into and thank you for that. In the weeks and months that followed after this, you had, unfortunately, a lot of work you had to do to sort of clean this thing up, didn't you?
I couldn't clean it up. I could gather information, attempt to restore that information to some order, and to report that which had occurred in conformity with law. I could not undo that which had been done.
Right, you can't put money back in that had been taken illegally.
And I could not recover monies that had been wrongfully expended. But what I could do was to correct the reporting errors that were embedded in those FEC reports as a consequence of the spending, which was inaccurately reported to be by Mr. Broyhill.
That's essentially what happened. You had to go back and pull all the donation records and look at all the bank statements, and the previous reports had to be amended and sent into the FEC, put together as best as you could with what records you were able to recreate and gather, correct?
Yes.
From that point on, the FEC stopped communicating directly, so to speak, with the campaign, and at that point, at least for the months that followed, was sort of in a correspondence back and forth between you and the FEC. Would that be fair?
I don't recall the precise steps or measures that were taken, but we had to institute a new electronic filing relationship. I re-engaged Ad Astra, which had done the reporting work previously. I communicated with the commission, advised the commission of, I believe, of my mailing address and the means and mechanisms by which the commission could communicate with me. And then I initiated the sua sponte reporting that we discussed yesterday afternoon.
In recreating those records and trying to respond to the FEC about what happened about this thing and give them information, and obviously, as we talked about yesterday, since you weren't involved in the day-to-day before, it's always difficult to reconstruct something that you weren't part of when it was first happening. Isn't that correct?
It was, and we didn't have records from the committee.
And I mean, you are a lawyer, and you talked about you do commercial litigation. So I mean, you are used to recreating things in preparation sometimes of commercial litigation. But I mean, when you don't have the information available to you, and particularly when you're dealing with information that's been clearly falsified and money gone and all that, it just makes it a nightmare to try to recreate something that makes sense, correct?
It was difficult because we did not have the committee's checkbook, the committee's computer, the records of the committee. We had only those materials we were able to obtain from the bank.
Now, in the meanwhile, in sort of preparation of being able, and let me qualify that question, not in preparation, of preparing reports, but just in the course of life, we can't ignore the fact that a tragedy occurred, and that was being addressed, correct?
Correct.
Ms. Hahn was in the hospital for a day or so, and we're going to hear testimony about that, I'm sure, but I mean, she passes away. There are memorial services for her. Did you attend any of them?
I did.
There are functions being held in her memory. There are a number of notable speakers arriving at these things and talking. It's sort of a gathering of notable members of the Democratic Party to honor her life and things that she was able to do in the time she was with us, correct?
Correct.
That included a number of the people that worked in the Brad Miller campaign, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Brad Miller himself, along with other elected officials whose lives had been touched by Ms. Hahn at some point along the way, correct? And having some, probably not the same amount, but some familiarity with, not as much as yours, I'm sure, but the political function. Sometimes when there's an event like this, it brings everybody together. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
I think that's fair.
And of course, in the course of getting together to honor this young woman's life, there's also had to have been the conversations about how could something like this have happened, correct?
I'm sure.
Would it be fair to say you were shocked, right?
I was shocked.
From what you were able to assess, forget as an attorney, just as a human being, would it be fair to say that in attendance at all of these events, almost everybody was shocked at this thing, correct? Nobody saw this coming.
Objection.
Sustained.
Well, he can make an observation as to what he observed, Your Honor.
Sustained.
All right, no, my objection.
My impression was that
Sustained.
okay.
Was there a lot of talk among the people that you were with about how this thing came to happen? I don't want to know the content of it, My only question is, was there a lot of talk among the people that attended these functions about how this could have happened?
Sir, I was not a participant in what I would call a lot of talk about how these things happened. I attended a service for Ms. Hahn, but the conversations in which I was a participant did not focus on speculation about how this could have happened.
And you were not engaged in any professional capacity to act as an attorney to investigate the criminal act of the assault on Mr. Hahn and the killing of Mrs. Hahn. You weren't involved in that investigation, other than as your role here, as to regards to your meeting with them the week prior, your conversations with them by email during the week, and your revelations upon what you learned about their bank account after the event had occurred. You were a witness, not a participant in the investigation, correct?
Correct, except that insofar as the committee required representation before the Federal Election Commission, with the consent of Congressman Miller, I served as counsel to the committee.
Correct. And in that capacity, you had to write response letters to the Federal Elections Commission, correct?
I initiated communication and responded to communication in that capacity.
And in some of those response letters, you recall writing a letter on you recall communicating in your letters to a chairperson of the Federal Election Commission by the name of Ms. Ellen L. Weintraub.
My belief is that my communication with the chair of the commission was my sua sponte submission accompanied by or including language which would have initiated a complaint against Mr. Broyhill, but I have not examined that correspondence recently.
Excuse me one second. Pull me up. Here, on the stand today, that it would be difficult for you to remember every piece of correspondence that you have had to mail out back in May of 2013 without perhaps being given the opportunity to see the correspondence. Would that be fair?
I think that's fair.
Would looking at the correspondence help refresh your recollection about mailing letters and what you would have indicated to the FEC if you were to see it?
Certainly could.
Thank you. That's going to be 2. Mr. Wallace, let me show you what I just marked as the Defendant's Exhibit 1 for identification and ask if that helps refresh your recollection about whether or not you sent a letter back on May 13th of 2013 to a Ms. Ellen L. Weintraub, who you identified in the letter as the chair of the FEC Commission, Federal Election Commission.
It is not the sua sponte submission that I made, which may have been directed instead to the Office of General Counsel at the Commission. This is instead a response to a notice of civil penalty that was issued by the Commission with respect to the failure to file a report in January. This is the report for the last period in 2012, which is the subject of the February 15th, 2013 letter.
Exactly. You sent, and you testified to this yesterday, that upon finding out the impropriety of the bank account, you went and reconstructed what you could with the information that there was to create, and sent and again, we keep throwing our lawyer words, sua sponte, just on your own. No one demanding you to do it. The Federal Election Commission didn't ask you to do it. It's just you acting on behalf of the campaign, saying, "Look, we're going to come out front on this thing, and we're finding out about this too. This is news to us too, and we're telling you this is what we found out, and you're presenting it to the Federal Elections Commission." Correct?
Correct.
Which is about everything. It's not just about the stealing of the money. It's also about everything. The refunds that are being made to people in excess of. You got to address everything, right?
It would have been my goal to address
as much as you could,
as much as I could, the reporting errors, the embezzlement from the account. It would have been my goal to make it full, fair disclosure to the Commission with respect to the activities in the committee's account.
Exactly. And the Federal Elections Commission, by your testimony, responded by saying, okay, well, that may be so, but we're going to assess a civil penalty against the campaign account for whatever reporting failures they found, correct?
Sir, I'm not sure what the sequence of communications with the commission were. I do not believe this to have been the first. This is a response to the imposition of a civil penalty. The penalty, sir, is calculated based on theoretical activity of the committee. That theoretical activity, which had been calculated by the commission, did not occur, in fact, because the commission was unaware or did not take into consideration that the Miller Committee was not actively fundraising and spending in the same fashion that an active candidate would. So a civil penalty was calculated by the commission using a formula which was inapplicable to the circumstances of this committee. I therefore composed this letter in response to the commission and
Correct.
submitted it,
Correct.
setting forth for the commission the position of the committee.
I wasn't intending to suggest that their decision to you or letter to you of saying a civil penalty was a finality thing. I mean, the lawyers, we very seldom let things sit. Well, if we can respond, we will, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you did.
And I did.
This was, and then in getting the notice of the civil penalty, this was your response on May 13th to their notification that a civil penalty was going to be imposed, correct? I mean, you addressed...
They'd sent a notice of the imposition of a civil penalty that assumed committee activities in the approximate amount of $83,000. It appeared to me from committee's records that the total activities were in the range of $17,500. And so for the reasons set forth in this letter and based upon the application of the formula, I requested that the commission abate the civil penalty that had been proposed.
Right. A civil penalty, by the way, which typically civil penalties would be paid by the campaign account for most candidates that are in that situation, correct?
Certainly can be.
But the campaign account in this instance was insolvent. It didn't have any money.
It was insolvent when we first examined the records at PNC.
Which was in April of 2013, after the attack on Ms. Hahn, after that attack on the 22nd. It's not till after that you go to the bank and find out that there's no money in the bank.
Correct.
Actually, the fact that there was no money in the bank pre-existed that date. That was just the first time you found out about it.
Correct.
But when you were writing the letter, unless you raised money to the campaign between that date and the May 13th account, as of the date when this all started, when you got started in trying to straighten out this mess, there was no money in the account.
When I first visited the PNC branch, there was a deficit in the account.
And now you have the FEC sending you a notification that they're imposing a civil penalty, which is a financial penalty against the campaign account, to be paid, correct?
Correct.
And you have well, I won't say candidate, you have a politician who has retired from office, is not seeking office, so you don't have active donors bringing money back into the account, correct?
Correct. There was not active fundraising going on at that time.
Right. So now you're faced, you and Congressman Miller, and not let me be clear, not you personally, but the campaign account, the campaign activity for the Brad Miller campaign is faced with having to pay this penalty to the FEC for this reported impropriety, and this committee that you're trying to help out is without funds essentially to do that. So as being a good lawyer, send the reply. This was the reply of May 13th, where you laid out for them in fairly, well, 3 pages. The 4th page is just your signature page, laying out to the best that you were able to determine what had happened here, correct?
Yes, sir.
Including about hiring Sky Blue Strategies, the amount they'd been paid, about winding down the campaign, about meeting with Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn. You sort of gave them a factual recitation of events, correct?
Yes.
And then in that letter on May 13th, you indicated that on the 22nd of April, Mr. Broyhill met with Ms. Hahn, apparently to address her concerns regarding the activities of Mr. Broyhill, and that during this meeting, Mr. Broyhill assaulted Ms. Hahn, resulting in her death.
Yes,
You
sir.
wrote that.
I
correct?
did.
Now, you based that, you were not involved in the investigation of the case, correct?
I was not.
You had no direct knowledge of that, correct?
I did not have any direct knowledge of that.
And you indicated that in your letter, that you were basing that on a news account from the News and Observer, a local newspaper.
Yes, sir.
It was not based upon any knowledge that had been passed on to you by police, authorities, or anyone, and you certainly had no direct knowledge of that.
Correct.
Now, do you recall getting a fairly immediate response to that?
I do not, sir.
Okay. That was, you recall that letter being on the, for Defendant's Exhibit 1, being written by you to the Commission on, we said May 13th. You recall then, 4 days later, contacting a different department as on behalf of the Brad Miller Committee, not with the Federal Elections Commission, but with the PNC Bank, requesting all the bank statements.
Sir, I had to work through, as I recall it, the Office of General Counsel at the PNC Bank in order to obtain the records that I was seeking.
You recall, as you sit here today, just from your memory, writing a letter to a Mr. Patrick Berry from the legal department of PNC Bank on May 17th, 4 days after the letter that went to the FEC.
Sir, that's not inconsistent with my memory. I don't have a particular memory of the content of that correspondence.
Would it refresh your recollection if you could see a piece of correspondence written by you at that time?
It would.
All right. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Take a moment and, well, first, before, as to content, does that help refresh your recollection as to whether or not, after looking at Defendant's Exhibit 2, marked for identification, whether or not you would have sent a letter to Patrick Berry on May 17th of 2013, who was a member of the legal department of PNC Bank?
It does, sir.
And did you, in fact, do that?
I did.
Let me know when you've had a chance to review it.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Now, in that letter to Mr. Berry, 4 days after writing the letter to the FEC, the letter on the 13th to the FEC, you had indicated that, based upon the news report that you had read, Mr. Broyhill met with Ms. Hahn to address concerns regarding activities of Mr. Broyhill, correct? That's the one I asked you about before.
Yes, sir.
You agree you don't have any direct knowledge, you were just putting something in the letter based upon an article from a newspaper article, and you indicated that in that letter, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, 4 days later, on the letter that was being sent to the legal department of the bank, you wrote to them that the consultant who engaged in the embezzlement activities was confronted and in response assaulted and killed his employer. You remember writing that?
I do. I see it.
And again, you have no basis. There was no basis for that other than what? News articles, conversations at these memorial events or other democratic events. You had no basis upon which to write that. Is that fair?
Well, I would not agree with that. I had, by this time, read the several news accounts, had been interviewed by the Raleigh Police Department. And in this instance, as distinguished from the letter to Ms. Weintraub, chair of the commission, I'm not making a communication to a governmental agency or testifying under oath. I'm communicating with the PNC Bank, articulating the urgency and the nature of the need that the committee had to obtain the records. And I wanted to make that point.
I understand that, but you're telling the legal department, this gentleman from their legal department, that Ms. Hahn confronted Mr. Broyhill about the improprieties with the account on that day. That's what you wrote in the letter, right?
Yes, sir.
You have no basis upon which to write that. You had no direct knowledge of that.
I had no direct knowledge of that. You're right.
You had not seen a police report, correct?
I had not seen a police report.
You had
correct.
not talked to an eyewitness. There was, to your knowledge, was there an eyewitness in the room that had given a description in a news article that this is what had occurred?
I don't recall reading an eyewitness account from which I drew this information, but this is the product of my growing awareness of the facts and circumstances that I wanted to be able to communicate to the bank in order to impress upon the bank the urgency of providing the records that the committee needed.
Because this is the word that was being passed around. By the time you were writing this letter, the word that was being passed around was that that's what must have happened. Jamie must have confronted John, and this is why it happened. Isn't that correct?
I'm not sure, sir, the precise basis upon which I formed my belief with respect to the sequence of events. But as I say, by that time I had read both news accounts and communicated with the Raleigh Police Department. So I can't tell you exactly what the precise foundation for my belief was, but I had various sources of information from which I drew in communicating this to the bank.
But they weren't any official source of information. Isn't that true?
Well, I believe...
You wouldn't, as a politician, you certainly wouldn't consider a newspaper account as an official report, would you?
No, but as I say, I'd been in communication with the Raleigh Police Department during that time as well.
But you weren't part of the investigation other than as a witness in this case.
That's correct.
You don't know what they found out. You didn't talk to the witnesses. You didn't go to the crime scene. You didn't have any of that information. This was, as you said, a shock to you when you heard about what happened to Ms. Hahn. You didn't have any reason to believe it was going to happen. Isn't that true?
I did not have any reason to believe it was going to happen. That is true.
You didn't have any reason to believe there was any criminal activity afoot.
I didn't have factual information from which to draw that conclusion, correct?
And yet you were writing letters on behalf of the campaign committee, which was facing this civil penalty, that this is in fact what happened, based upon the information that was being reported to you.
Well, as you have correctly pointed out, in my communication to the chair of the Federal Election Commission, I pointed out to the chair that I was providing information elicited from a newspaper account. Now, in this letter to the bank, I did not do that, but instead drew from the collection of information that I had assembled over the course of that approximately 1 month period subsequent to the death of Ms. Hahn.
Right. But when we write these things as attorneys, particularly when we know there's a homicide investigation going on, these documents often do become part of the investigation, don't they? As is the case here.
Sir, they can become part of an investigation, certainly.
My point is, and I'm not accusing you of anything. Look, you were trying to do the best thing you could do as a lawyer for a client, essentially a pro bono client. I mean, you're doing this for free, correct?
Yes, it was volunteer service for the committee.
Right. To try to figure out how to deal with this civil penalty that's been assessed against a campaign account that has no money inside of it to pay the penalty, correct?
Correct. At that time, correct.
And so you're reporting these things that you're hearing them in the newspaper. And maybe you did shorthand a little bit with Mr. Berry by not telling him that the information you're passing along is from a newspaper account or wherever else you got it. But nevertheless, that's what you wrote in the letter.
Yes, sir.
So through the campaign's responses to the FEC, to the bank, whatever, the response is now, and you're acting as the attorney now for the campaign account, that this is what happened. That Ms. Hahn was confronted by that Mr. Broyhill was confronted by Ms. Hahn, and that's what precipitated these events.
In my letter of May 17th, 2013, to Mr. Berry in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I did not cite the News and Observer account nor any other sources for the information I provided. That's correct.
But it's agreed. There is no basis in fact or direct knowledge on your part or participation in investigation that truly supports that allegation, other than things you read in the newspaper or perhaps heard from other people involved in this campaign. Isn't that true?
Including the Raleigh Police Department.
Yeah.
That's correct. I did not have direct personal knowledge of the events that occurred on April 22nd.
And if you followed it in your preparation of these responses, you know the Raleigh Police Department was not in the room when this event occurred. Isn't that true?
I certainly believe that to be true.
If I can have a moment here.
Yes, sir.
Very much. You've been very helpful, and you've in a number of different ways, with not just with this case, but I thank you for your service to trying to help the people that were involved in this thing. Thank you very much.
Redirect.
One more question.
Thank you, sir. You may step down.
Yes, Your Honor, the state would ask to publish State's Exhibit 102 this time.
All right.
And it may be at the witness stand, Your Honor, Mr. Schiff.
And, all right. And in which method are you seeking to publish that?
Just a single photo.
Circulating it to the jurors? Yes, sir. Bailiff, if you would hand the photograph to the jurors. Members of the jury, just, it's a photograph, Exhibit 102. Bailiff, if you'll provide that entire stack.
State's Exhibit 102. Just, may I approach the
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Schiff?
All right, so members of the jury, you're being shown an exhibit. If you'll just pass it among yourselves, examine it individually, carefully, and without comment.
Statement called Charles Williford to the stand.
We're going to ask to be heard on something prior to the testimony of this witness outside the court.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute recess then until 10 minutes till 11. If you'll recall the instructions, don't talk among yourselves or with anyone else about the case. Don't form or express any opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation. Please have no conversations with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. Gather in the deliberation room at, let's just say, 5 minutes till 11. Everyone else, please remain seated while the jurors excuse themselves. Jury, Mr. Williford, if you want to go ahead and be seated up here, and then let me hear from counsel what the issues are.
Judge, I definitely will want to put this on the record, but I will defer to Your Honor in the manner and the way you want to do this. I don't know if you want Mr. Williford in the room. I'll leave that up to you. There's some things that we need to address. Perhaps we could approach first, and I'll come back and put it on the record, if that's all right.
That's fine. All right. Good morning, Mr. Williford.
Good morning, Mr. Judge.
A couple things I just want to caution you outside the presence of the jury with respect to some concerns that the attorneys have raised. We had a brief conversation yesterday about the fact that you were under subpoena, and you expressed how difficult it was for you personally to be here today, and we certainly appreciate you honoring the subpoena and being here. One concern is that apparently in describing how difficult it was for you to be here, you used the term, "It's going to be a killer for me to be here." And we would ask that in the context of this trial that you not use colloquialisms like that in front of the jury. This obviously is a homicide trial, and we try to protect the jury from hearing colloquialisms like that may have some prejudice or impact on the jury. Do you understand?
Yes, sir. Duly noted. My mistake. I was thinking personal, nothing else.
Yes, sir.
That will not happen again.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I apologize.
All right. And then the other thing that was brought to my attention is that there is a conversation that may or may not come into evidence or may or may not be referenced where between yourself and another individual who speculated that that Mr. Broyhill had been charged with homicide and that it would potentially be a capital case, a death penalty case, or some other outcome. And I'll just caution you that I don't anticipate that you will be asked any question that will require you to give an answer about that particular part of the conversation. But I'm instructing you not to reference that speculation that you heard in that conversation or unless without my specific direction to do so.
I duly noted again, and I don't even remember the conversation.
Very good. All right, so just to make it clear that outside
Yes,
the
sir.
presence of the jury, again, I just wanted to caution you about those things and those specific concerns that have been brought to my attention.
Yes, sir.
All right, very good. Anything further, Mr. Arbor, Mr. Fawcett?
Not from the state, Your
All right, very good. Let's bring jurors in. Well, I'm sorry, we're in recess until 5 minutes till 11.
Clerk will stand in recess 5 minutes to his office.